Brazil, the land of carnival, samba, soccer, and oil. Indeed, VisualPolitik community, Brazil is not only the cradle of the Amazon, the lungs of our planet, but also one of the world's largest oil producers, as well as the largest producer in all of Latin America. In fact, in 2022, Brazil produced more than 4% of all the oil extracted in the world. Therefore, it is not surprising that it rubs shoulders with major oil producers in the Middle East, such as Kuwait, Iran, or the United Arab Emirates. Even so, Brazil is not only constantly on the lips of analysts because of its strong oil position. Less than a year ago, Latin America's largest economy made headlines around the world because of news like this.
Brazil presidential election. Lula defeats Bolsonaro by thin margin.
Indeed, Lula, who has been considered by many as the rock star of the left in Latin America, returned to power by a very narrow margin in the elections against former President Bolsonaro, Trump's ally, who also failed to extend his mandate. And, as many of you will remember, this also caused one of the most unfortunate incidents in Brazilian history. A bunch of citizens, unhappy with the outcome, took a cue from the United States and stormed the nation's Congress. Apparently, that's just a thing that happens now. However, luckily, they achieved little more than being arrested, and some were injured, because in the reality, Lula had won. And in January of this year, he assumed power. Since then, Lula has emphasized social and above all, environmental measures. Therefore, many fear that with the third Lula presidency, the end of Brazilian oil has come. After all, this is exactly the path followed by Gustavo Petro's Colombia. The point is that all of this has made us on VisualPolitik wonder about a few things. How did Brazil become an oil power? What role did oil play in Lula's first two presidencies? Will Lula change his position on oil to comply with the climate agenda? Will this be the beginning of the end of Brazilian oil? Today, we're going to answer all of these questions, but first, let's look at some history.
A long road.
How long do you think it took Brazil to become one of the major oil powers? I'm sure many of you will think that as soon as oil was found, money started just pouring in from all directions. But the reality is that, like Rome, oil-producing Brazil was not built in a day. The road to becoming one of the 10 largest oil-producing powers was full of failures and, above all, was long. More than a whole century since its first oil exploration. You see, after gaining independence in 1822, the first barrels of oil were not extracted in Brazil until 1892 with Eugenio Ferreira de Camargo, although only 2 barrels were extracted. Nevertheless, with this first extraction, the Brazilian state realized the enormous potential of its subsoil, and in the beginning of the 20th century, the public initiative joined the private sector in the search for commercial oil fields. In 1907, the Brazilian government created the Geological and Mineralogical Service of Brazil, which drilled 60 wells in search of oil. Although it wasn't that successful. However, in 1941, with the help of the newly created National Petroleum Council, the first commercial well was finally established. But the country's production was still not abundant. By the end of the 1940s, Brazil was only producing 2,700 barrels per day at a time when its domestic demand was more than 170,000 barrels per day due to the industrialization process that the country was undergoing. Nevertheless, this was to begin to change with the birth of Brazil's major oil player. In 1953, the Brazilian government founded a company that would shape the state's monopoly on oil research, drilling, refining, and transportation. Petróleo Brasileiro, SA, better known as Petrobras, was born. Many of you already know that today, Petrobras is Brazil's most important company. But did you know that it spent its first 15 years of existence being almost totally unproductive? The truth is, VisualPolitik viewers, it was not until 1968 that Petrobras made its first discovery, the Guaracema field, although this would seem like nothing compared to the 2 fields it discovered 6 years later in the Campos Basin, the Garupa and Pargo fields. Now, do you think that Brazil was all set to become the oil power it is today? Well, nothing could be further from the truth. By 1980, Brazilian production only covered 17% of domestic demand. Therefore, that same year, the government set a goal of 500,000 barrels per day of production by 1985. Yet, it was not until the 1995 constitutional reform that the Brazilian oil sector really began to bear fruit. This reform opened the sector to private competition, lifted restrictions on the entry of foreign capital, and more importantly, ended the monopoly of Petrobras, which became a semi-public company with the majority of shares in the hands of the state. With this change, production increased and Brazil achieved the longed-for self-sufficiency in the early 2000s. However, more than a century had passed since that first small oil extraction in 1892, and Brazil was still not in the top 10 of the great oil powers. But that would change with the arrival of one of the most significant figures in Latin American politics, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva.
Lula, the lucky one.
In order for your name to go down in politics history, it is often not about having the best managers, but it is also about being lucky. And Lula, in his first 2 presidencies, was lucky. You see, the Brazilian leader, who won his first presidential elections in 2002, managed to lead Brazil through a period of prosperity. Not so much because of his impeccable management of the economy, but above all because of several lucky breaks, the most important of which was this one.
Brazil discovers country's largest oil field.
Indeed, VisualPolitik viewers, in 2007, one of the largest oil fields in the country, and indeed in the world, was discovered, the Tupi field, a field with reserves of about 29 billion barrels of oil. This would finally place Brazil among the 10 largest oil producers in the world. Now, Lula was no fool. The cost was not going to be low. In 2010, he passed laws so that part of the company's profits would go to the public coffers. In addition, it is also true that he benefited Petrobras, with which he signed an agreement allowing it to exploit and produce up to 5 billion barrels of oil for 40 years. But even with all this, his luck did not end there. Think about it, Lula came to power in a time of certain stability. His predecessor managed to tame inflation and avoid a major recession. But most importantly of all, Lula came right in the middle of the well-known commodity super cycle, a time when commodity prices were skyrocketing. In fact, with the arrival of Lula, the trade surplus went from $10 billion in 2002 to $47 billion in 2007, thanks to the discovery of the oil field and the high costs of raw materials. So let's just say it's no wonder that the country grew at an average of 4.5% per year during his first 2 presidencies. And do you know what he did with all the money he managed to raise? Well, in short, he extended social programs. Or, to put it another way, he enlarged the size of the state. Lula launched programs such as Bolsa Familia, which gave monthly aid to the poorest families in the country, or Hambre Zero, a campaign that aimed to reduce the number of people who were going hungry. And to be perfectly honest, they were a great success. As you can see, the percentage of the Brazilian population in poverty fell by more than 15 percentage points between 2001 and 2011, both because of the Bolsa Familia program, which benefited 12.4 million households, and because of the increase in the employed population from 77 million to more than 90 million people. And not only that, Lula also began to promote measures for the protection of the environment, particularly against the deforestation of the Amazon. To give you an idea, the area deforested annually between 2000 and 2005 was 34,700 kilometers squared, an area almost equivalent to the size of Switzerland. However, from 2005 until the end of his presidency, this was reduced to 4,500 kilometers squared per year. At the time, Lula was tremendously committed to the protection of the Amazon, but his fight against greenhouse gas emissions caused by hydrocarbons such as oil and gas was not as strong. So why was this? Well, for one simple reason. Lula is what is known as an oil nationalist. So what does this mean? Basically, he cannot conceive of Brazil's progress without oil. Nevertheless, 13 years after the end of his second presidency, Lula has returned to the political scene. It's a very different political scenario than the one he encountered previously. For example, today the fight for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is much more intense. So you might ask, will Lula give in to the demands of the climate agenda to the detriment of his people? Could we be looking at the end of the oil industry in Brazil? Well, let's find out.
Lula's decision.
Lula's return to power was a relief for much of the international community who were concerned about Bolsonaro's environmental mismanagement in Brazil. It should be noted that he closed several nature protection agencies, such as the Chico Mendes Institute. He reduced spending on climate change mitigation policies by 93%, and deforestation was rampant in several parts of the country. In some places, deforestation grew by 34% during his presidency. Nevertheless, although many have rejoiced at Lula's return, the reality is that the scenario is not as favorable as as in his first cycle. The Congress is dominated by Bolsonarists, the effects of the pandemic are still being felt, especially with a debt that has reached 88% of GDP, poverty levels are still around 30%, and interest rates are stuck at 13.75%, something that has led Lula to an all-out confrontation with the central bank. And, to top it all off, the country's growth projections are not the best either. In fact, Brazil is expected to grow more than half a point behind the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean. However, against all odds, the Brazilian economy has actually been a surprise.
Brazil's economy improves under Lula, defies central bank rates. A rebound in Brazil's agriculture and a strong labor market helped deliver far better results than economists had forecast at the start of 2023.
In addition, during these first months of his new presidency, Lula has promoted several reforms reminiscent of his first two presidencies. For example, he has reopened the Bolsa Familia program that Bolsonaro closed in 2021 and reinstated the National Food Security Council. Meanwhile, on the environmental front, he reopened the Amazon Fund, signed laws to seize illegally deforested land, and reopened the Bolsa Verde program, which gives money to poor families living in traditional communities who are responsible for protecting the environment. In general, these measures contribute to Brazil's repositioning as a leader in the environmental struggle. Even so, the question many are asking is Lula willing to emulate Gustavo Petro to go one step further and do away with national oil? Well, the truth is that the chances of Lula sacrificing the Brazilian oil industry to achieve this goal are rather low, if not non-existent.
Lula described Gustavo Petro's proposal to suspend oil production as unreal. Former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva assured that the use of hydrocarbons is still necessary in the world and gave as an example the situation in Germany.
In fact, if Lula has already managed to place Brazil among the world's top 10 oil producers, his goal now is to make it the world's fourth largest producer of all of them. For this reason, Petrobras expects to increase daily production from 3 to 5 million barrels by 2030. And not only that, the Brazilian oil giant is also trying to get a license to be able to drill in the Amazon basin, an area where there are estimated reserves of up to 30 billion barrels of oil and where it is willing to invest $6 billion in exploration alone over the next 5 years. Added to this is the fact that between 2022 and now, Brazil has approved the largest number of oil and gas projects behind only Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And this is not so unusual. Just remember that projections indicate that Petrobras will provide more than $200 billion in revenues to the state coffers in the next 5 years. $200 billion that Lula is counting on to carry out his social policies. You see, VisualPolitik community, it does not appear that Brazil is going to break with its oil tradition with Lula. In reality, it seems that exactly the opposite will happen. His oil gamble will become even stronger. Yes, it is true. He has restored initiatives to fight against factors contributing to climate change, such as deforestation, but oil exploration in Brazil seems non-negotiable, especially if Lula wants to maintain his social spending. Of course, the environment is one of Lula's priorities, but at the end of the day, petrodollars continue to dominate the scale of those priorities. But at this point, the questions are now over to you. Do you think that Lula will ultimately reduce the influence of the oil industry in Brazil? What position do you think Lula had on the oil industry? You can leave me your answers in the comments below. And as always, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every single week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell button down there so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it so we know. All the best, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.